Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 296. I'm delighted to welcome onto the podcast today, Caws. Gray, how are we doing?
I'm good, thank you. 296, that's a brilliant.
We're approaching the 300, Gray, which
The
we've got big
300
plans
mark, I
for.
like that.
Big plans for the 300, which the listeners will enjoy, I'm sure. Well, no, thank you very much for coming on. It was obviously Josh Fletcher that put us in contact. So a big thank you to Josh. It's going to be quite a different episode, this one, which the listeners will understand a little bit more about in a second. But I'm really excited and intrigued to dive into some of the topics that we got lined up because I think it can really benefit what coaches are currently doing. Just before we go into all that, though, let's start on you, your background. Can you give us a little insight into what you've done previously and also what you do now?
Certainly, yeah. So thanks for inviting me. And again, as you say, thanks to Josh for recommending me to the podcast. I am currently teaching something called the Oxygen Advantage Breathwork or breath training. And this is how I met Josh, actually, because he was doing the teacher training with me. So I'm privileged to be able to train the trainers, which is all good fun, which means I meet so many different people with so many different backgrounds. And Josh just thought it'd be a really good opportunity for me to chat with yourselves and chat with you, Ben, about some of the breath work or the breath training that really influences our performance, sports performance, but also general health and well-being. And I sort of like fell into this work just completely coincidentally. I didn't have any big aha moments or dramatic life events, but I used to work as a graphic designer and web designer back in sort of like 2000, late 2000s. And my mom was ill, and I just had a real urge to be able to help her through her illness. And I was a keen gym goer, fitness person. I loved my running. So I'm like, right, I'm going to change career. And I trained as a personal trainer. So I did part-time personal training, got a diploma in personal training, level 3, level 4. And then I wanted to teach running technique because my real joy, my real love was trail running, or is trail running. And just completely coincidentally, the running coach that I decided to choose to train with was is a cardio physiotherapist. So he's working at one of the London's top hospitals, and he's working with heart and lung operations. So he's been doing prehab and rehab from serious illness and operations. So the first session I had with Robin, where I thought he was going to be testing my speed and my time and etc., he checked my breath rate, and I'm like, why? Why is this guy checking? How is he checking? Why is he checking how I'm breathing? And I suppose that was the aha moment, because I suddenly realized from that first training session that breathing is key to energy efficiency, to sports performance, to being a human being. And it's something that I think is, in particularly in the health and well-being industry, is missed. And I think it's a huge key to how we can really get the edge in terms of performance, sports performance, and not just by doing separate breathing exercises or breath work. What is brilliant is that you can start to incorporate it into any training program that you're doing. And I think this is what I've learned as a coach training coaches. I've had people like Josh, who are like top strength and conditioning coaches, nutritional therapists, hypnotists, hypnotherapists, all of these different types of people with different skill sets coming along. And I've just realized how you can incorporate the principles of what I'm hopefully sharing with you today into anything. So that was a big eye opener. I trained then as a running coach, and the whole of my sort of like training as a running coach was focusing on breath first. How are you breathing? And then the more efficient you are in your breathing, the more efficient you're going to be in your movement. and vice versa. The more efficient you are in your movement, the more efficient you're going to be in your breathing. So breath is really at the heart of everything that I teach. I went on then to meet, through the running, through teaching running technique, a guy called Patrick McEwen, who's based in Ireland. And Patrick McEwen has over 20 odd years worth of research and experience in breathwork. So breathwork has suddenly become very trendy at the minute, and it's all over Instagram and everywhere. But Patrick has been teaching this technique for years and years and years. And therefore, he's got lots of scientific studies, lots of papers that are backing up what we're talking about. And I think for me, and for a lot of people, that's the key, because we can think of breathwork as being a little bit woo-woo. But actually, when we talk about, here are some scientific papers about repeated sprintability and how what we're doing in our breathwork is increasing our repeated sprintability, what breathwork is doing in terms of down-regulating the nervous system, nasal, all of these technical stuff that, if you like your gadgets and you want sort of like the research behind it, we are backing that up. We're showing how things are working with current science. We know that science always changes, so it's not always set in stone, but there's so much science behind what we are sharing and what we are doing that helps people take that on board, makes it credible. I think is what I see. So I'm back to where I'm at now. Is I'm training the trainers, which, as I say, is a real honor, and it's such a learning experience for me. I'm also working one-to-one with a few clients, whether that's sort of like recreational athletes. I've worked with a couple of Olympic athletes, and it's nice because it's just a complete mix. And I'm finding that the same thing is helping everybody. And the other brilliant thing about it is it's simple. I think that's so important. You don't have to have this extra complex training program that you have to add on to your current training program, because if that's the case, you're not going to do it. You're not going to do it. So I'm working one-to-one. I'm also doing quite a bit of corporate work now as well. So it's great. It's busy. It's good that breathwork is out there a little bit more, and it's nice to also have that recognition that it's helping people. So getting that feedback as well. So not only we've got the science backing up what we're doing, I'm seeing real-time data from clients as well.
It seems pretty crazy, doesn't it, that such a fundamental skill, do we call it, is not focused on that much. And we obviously within football, we talk a lot about football fitness and conditioning players for football, without even probably bearing any sort of thought to how we breathe and how players breathe. And the exciting thing I think about this conversation is what you just mentioned before, that I think a lot of people, if we talk about implementing breathwork with players, would imagine all players in a room together, maybe lying down, more of like a meditation sort of setup. And I know a lot of the things that we've spoke about before the conversation is, it doesn't have to be that. It can be literally what you are doing on a daily basis, not adding any additional sessions into what you're doing, but maximizing what you're actually doing. And I think that's the exciting bit for me, is like to dive into the details now and to say, right, where can this fit, and what does it look like? So no, I really appreciate giving a bit of the background and the benefits around it. And I just really want to make it a little bit more precise to the listeners now as well. So I think a lot of people would have maybe even used some element of breath work for possibly recovery and thought about it in terms of down regulating. But I thought we could start on the opposite side of it, and in terms of the fitness side, because I just mentioned to you before, I've just seen this morning, clubs are going back to pre-season now, so it's a really good time for us to speak about this sort of thing. They're going to be going into probably testing, relatively intense conditioning sessions. So if we've got a group of 20 players that are going to be working through some sort of conditioning, small-sided games, maybe it's some sort of a fitness test, where would you encourage coaches to start focusing and maybe starting to implement some sort of breath work into those sessions?
So I think that the starting point I would encourage is firstly to with the majority of the training that you're doing, sort of like endurance, if you're thinking about starting off from an endurance point of view, is just make sure that everything is in and out through the nose. And it sounds really obvious, but actually it isn't. And it's interesting to watch certain athletes literally with their mouths wide open and breathing hard sometimes in and out through the mouths. So I would start with nasal breathing, and not just, I think we've got to go almost like one step back as well, because it's all well and good to say to a group of players, right, well, let's start nasal breathing as you're doing sprint, etc., or you're doing gentle jogs or warming up. But if they're not used to that in their daily life, so this is where you want to start off with. So actually, how are you breathing? How are you breathing as a human being? I think this is key, that we don't think of breath work as something completely separate and that we only do when we're training. Because if you can work on the majority of your breath work when you're not training, think how then what you bring into the training, you're just putting the cherry on the top. So start off with, how are you breathing in everyday life? Are you breathing predominantly through the nose? And again, you only have to look, you only have to Google nasal breathing and you'll see the benefits, because it's warming, it's humidifying, it's killing pathogens, and it's also helping to have that more connection with the diaphragm. So it's making your breathing more efficient. So when we think of posture and stability and balance, that whole diaphragm connection is going to play, obviously, make a big difference when you're into training. If you can breathe as much as possible through the nose in daily life, then bring it into your warm-up. So I would say that start off bringing it into your warm-up. Notice whether you can do it as you're warming up. If that works, then you can start to bring it into slightly more higher intensity stuff. But ideally, you want to be building that gradually, because if we say, right, just do it straight away, and if people start to slow down, or they start to struggle, or they just go, this isn't working for me, you're going to stop doing it. So just do it gradually. But I would say that, Ben, is the real starting point, is nasal breathing.
And that probably doesn't sound that much to people, but if you've not done it, it's going to be a bit of a shock, isn't it? Just initially,
Yeah.
even like you say, just going through some sort of mobility or just quite a low intensity warm up can be quite challenging, can't it, initially?
Definitely. And think again, I always like, when I'm working with clients, I always like to say why and think of the logic of it. Is if you think about aerobic training, aerobic means with oxygen. If you can balance carbon dioxide and oxygen within the blood and not go anaerobic, i.e. get out of breath, you should be able to do it with the mouth closed. So think about, like, if you're doing heart rate training, if you breathe in and out through the nose, you are going to be able to comfortably settle into zone 2, zone 3 training. The more, and I think that word you used at the very beginning, Ben, when you said skill, because it is a skill and it is something that is learned. And the more you practice it, the more it just becomes natural. You don't even have to think about it. But you should then be able to get up to quite a high intensity, keeping that breath in and out through the nose. So I sort of like think about it, to keep it simple, almost like in 2 gears. The first gear is, this is easy, you don't even have to think about it. The breath is easy as I'm warming up. But then you should be able to push it where you're getting up to sort of like that aerobic threshold. Think what that term means, breathing, working with oxygen. You should be able to get to that limit where you're really, really getting to the aerobic threshold, but keep that breath in and out through the nose. So it's challenging. It's challenging, but think of the benefits you're getting from that. And the other thing I would just add to that is, the more you do this in training, you don't have to think about it when you're playing. I think that's key as well, is you don't want to be thinking when you're playing about how am I breathing, because that's the last thing you want to have on your mind, because if you start thinking that, you're wasting energy thinking about how you're breathing. So the more you get it into your everyday life, the more you bring it into your training, just as you're learning drills, the more then when you play, you will breathe with more ease. You only have to look at the sort of like elite athletes, watch how they are breathing. If they're in control of the breath, they're in control of their movement. If you lose the breath, if you gas out, the movement's gone. You go beyond what is comfortable, and it's harder to recover. So that would be, I would think, again, going back to saying how simple you say it is, as it seems so simple. It doesn't cost you anything. That would certainly be sort of like, I would say, point one in terms of what you can bring into your training.
I just want to underline the point as well, because I know what some players and coaches could potentially be like is that they hear, okay, nasal breathing, we'll put that into when we do our 1500-meter time trial with the players for the first attempt at nasal breathing. That's probably not the wisest thing to do.
No.
That's not what we're saying. We're not putting it straight into some sort of maximal fitness test that you're going to be doing. Gray's obviously mentioned there that the key point is the lower intensity side of a session to start to implement it in, which will improve the your capacity, isn't it, to breathe at a higher intensity over time. What sort of time are you looking at? So if this is introduced to someone and they use it for a warm-up, say for a week, what's the sort of speed of progress you tend to see with people? Does that completely depend?
It does depend. I would say it can be quite quick, and I think I'd be surprised a lot of people maybe are already doing that without thinking about it. It might just need that little bit of focus. But I think it really is down to the individual. It's down to that mindset, isn't it? It's if you trust you are going to gain from this, you will do it. And I think that point you made there, Ben, about just really gradually introducing it, because then you feel the benefits of it. If you just go straight for it, or a coach says you have to do this, and you just struggle with it, and it slows you down. That's the problem, because it might slow you down at the beginning. You'll just go, this isn't working for me. So I think this is an ideal time to bring it into the training. But I really emphasize, the more you can do this in everyday life, the more you don't have to think about it when you come into the training space. I've worked with, just a very quick story. My great nephew plays for an academy, so his football academy, really talented. They could see how talented he was from about the age 8, literally doing loads of amazing football stuff. And he's 15 now, coming on 16 now, just finished his GCSEs. And a few years back, when he was in that stage where you think teenagers are not going to listen to their great uncle, I was giving him this information. I was saying, right, practice nasal breathing, the other stuff that we'll talk about in a minute. And he's now really at the top of his game. And I actually spoke to him the other night because I knew I was doing this podcast. I thought, just give me some feedback on how things are going. But what made the difference for him, I think, is the fact that he trusted it. He trusted himself to be able to explore. And he was curious about it. And also the coaches allowed him that ability to be able to explore as well. So they didn't just say, oh, you have to do this, and this. And he really is at the top of his game. I mean, loads of other stuff he does, but I think that's pure mindset. I see that from him as mindset. He realized he could get the edge with this. He's researched it. He's done more research than I have, because he was coming up with all of this stuff that I hadn't researched. And he's like, yeah, I've researched this, I've researched that. So it's just nice to see, yeah, it's one case, but that really was mindset that shifted to say, yeah, I can do this. But you can get it quite quickly. Do you know what I mean? You could suddenly realize that in a couple of weeks, right, this is making a difference. I feel better.
Just going back onto the higher intensity work that will be probably happening over the next few weeks at clubs, when they are doing a maximal fitness test, or they are doing quite a challenging conditioning session. And if we're talking about the zones potentially that they're working in like the upper zones, really. What can we implement in those sessions? Because if we're talking that we've introduced this nasal breathing in the lower intensity side of the sessions to gradually have an aim to increase it over time, at the right time. Yeah. But we're also going to be doing this more intense stuff. So what, in those type scenarios, what can coaches be thinking about with players in terms of breath work there?
So to build to build up to that increase in your nasal breathing to a higher intensity, you have to step back again. So what I would suggest is a lower intensity, but adding breath holds. Because what you do there is, if you're breathing normal breath in, normal breath out, and you can do this sitting, you don't even have to move doing it. So you're adding a breath hold. And what happens when you hold the breath at the bottom of a normal breath is CO2 starts to increase in the blood. So this is good because we are starting to build our tolerance to increased carbon dioxide. If we build our tolerance to increased carbon dioxide, that means you can go harder and faster and longer because you've built the physiological tolerance to it. Your body adapts to that increase in CO2, but also the mental aspect of it. So I've just been doing my breath holds this morning. Interestingly, because it was hot down here, there was a big difference. But it's challenging because you just feel this doesn't feel good. And it shouldn't feel good if you're doing it right. But what you'll find then long term, it starts to increase your performance at a higher level. So that means that then when you go into higher intensity, you're not having to breathe out CO2 because well, obviously you will breathe out CO2, but you're not having to breathe out as much CO2 because you're getting tolerant to it. You're building that tolerance to it. I hope that makes sense. The other thing that's happening is you're getting increased carbon dioxide. So you're building tolerance and your body's adapting to increased carbon dioxide. If you do it repeatedly, you're lowering the oxygen. So you're getting hypoxia. So you're getting lower oxygen levels. So think what you do at altitude training. That is all about training at high altitude to let the body adapt to lower oxygen levels. So if you do that repeatedly, you're getting what we call hypoxic hypercapnic training. Your body is adapting to that. And therefore, when you then go for those more intense periods, you are able to nasal breathe longer and go further with that. Nasal breathing also is going to increase your tolerance to CO2 because you're getting a little bit more buildup of CO2 as well. So just that is going to filter into that. There was a study done in the European Journal of Sports Science in 2018, and it was done on a group of rugby players, and they were doing repeated sprintability tests. And they did one group doing just a control group, and then they did another group doing breath holds as they were sprinting. And what they found is that the group doing breath holds increased their normal repeated sprintability. So that'd be a really good paper to share with coaches to say, look, if you add, this would be one thing that you could add into your sprints. Do you know what I mean? You could add a little bit of breath hold in there and see the increase in that. Then that will feed in to better endurance because your body's going to become more adaptable, more able to use oxygen better. The one thing to highlight, as with any training, is that anything that stresses the system, which obviously breath holds do, is there are contraindications. So if you've got high blood pressure, low blood pressure, any cardiovascular issues, if you're pregnant, you should avoid any strong breath holds. So that is important to get out there because I know there's quite a few things on the internet that people watch and they're doing these strong breath holds, but maybe sometimes they're not highlighting that it is a real stress on the system. So you're stressing the system for that adaptation. You're giving your body hormetic stress, really good stress, and then your body's adapting to that, and that will feed into your endurance.
I love the discussion around this is all the stuff that you're doing sort of behind the scenes in preparation for performance, and this is where it all fits, and this is exactly obviously why I wanted to have this conversation today about it. Might sound like a stupid question, but just to sort of define exactly what you mean when you're doing the breath holds, if we've got say we've got a 20-meter sprint set up, we're doing the repeated sprint work, is it literally a case of saying to players, right, big deep breath in, hold your breath, do your sprint, and then you recover at the other side?
No, it's the other way around. So again, I'd step back a minute from that, is do it in your daily life. So first thing is you walk into the park. I don't know, you're walking with the kids, you walk into the bus, obviously where it's safe, normal breath in, normal breath out. So we want to do it on the end of an exhale, because that means you get the effect, training effect quicker, basically, because the minute you do normal breath out, CO2 starts to rise, oxygen starts to drop. So start off just by walking. Do a few walks, pinch the nose if you want to pinch the nose. If that feels uncomfortable, just hold the breath and do a few steps. And maybe you do 5, 10, 15, 20 steps. Start off doing, yeah, that feels comfortable, but I want to take a breath. And then maybe go, right, I'm going to do it a little bit more. It'll start to feel uncomfortable. It should feel uncomfortable because that's the rise in CO2 is triggering the brain to say breathe. It's not low oxygen. If you're fit and healthy, it's not the fact that you have low oxygen that triggers that sensation to breathe. It's increased carbon dioxide. That's important to realize because you're not going to run out of oxygen if you are fit and healthy. So you'll feel uncomfortable. As I say, this morning it was really hot, so it felt really uncomfortable just after about 20, 30 paces for myself. So get used to it like that. Go with effort level and feeling rather than, for the minute, rather than distance. So go for light air hunger, medium air hunger, strong air hunger, so you can get the feel of it. That's building the mental toughness. And then you could use a hill. Use a hill. You're going to get a hill. You're going to get that feeling after 5 steps if you're going up a steep hill. So that's a really good way to do it. Then what you could do is, if you're going to bring it into the training area, is I think the repeated sprintability, they did 40 meters. They were doing 40 meters sprints. I'll share the paper with you, actually. Then you can share it with the online. But set up, say if you've got 20 meters, set up 20 meters and see how that works. And everybody's going to be different. So set up 20 meters and say, right, can you sprint 20 meters holding the breath? When you get to the end, the idea when you get to the end is not to be out of breath. We don't want to gas out. The minute you gas out, it takes longer to recover. So can you get to 20 meters? Can you recover after a few breaths? Can you just breathe in and out through the nose? If that works, extend it a little bit, go 30 meters, 35, 40 meters. So that's what I would play around with that, actually, and see how you could get how far you could get with the sprint. But as I say, I think it was 40 meters they did in this test.
You just mentioned there about a recovery from like an intense bout of exercise. So if we're going back to a conditioning drill or a fitness test, and the player is finishing that, and then they're having to recover to either do it again or do something else, what are we focusing on at that point? Am I right in saying it needs to be, we don't want too sharp a breath, we want things to be nice and smooth? Like what sort of things are we thinking about just in that maybe couple of minutes of recovery before they're ready to go again?
I think there's 2 things you could do here. And this is what I'll do with myself in running and with clients, is you could push it right to the edge and then do a couple of big breaths. Big breaths, because what you're doing there is you're getting rid of the CO2. So there's obviously going to be a point where that carbon dioxide levels raise high, but you need to breathe that out. You need to let go of that CO2. But the trick is a couple of big breaths and then come back to nasal breathing. And that'll be a little bit challenging because you'll have to slow it down. I could do with a few more bigger breaths, but if you can just do 2 or even 3 and come back down and slow the breath down as quickly as you can, that's a great way to recover. What we don't want to do is get to the point where you are so gassed out. And I think this is key because, again, it's like if you lose control of the breath, you've lost it. And this is what one of the guys, one of the Olympic athletes I was working with, he said it quite simply like that. He said, if I lose control of the breath, I know that's it. I know it's over. He said, so you get to the edge and then you recover as quickly as possible. If you lose control, we start to gas out, and then we get into that vicious circle of hyperventilation. So we don't want to get anywhere near hyperventilation, because if we start to hyperventilate, CO2 levels really drop. And actually, if the CO2 levels are too low, we don't get that the oxygen isn't taken as from the blood as well into the cells. So there's something called a Bohr effect that means that we need the right levels of carbon dioxide to actually help to unlock the red blood cells to let the oxygen into every single cell. So if you hyperventilate, you've lost it. So you want to get rid of CO2, then come back down as quickly as possible. Or what you could do, this is what I do sometimes, is not quite get to that point where you're on the edge, is get to that point and then keep nasal breathing to slow it down. And even if you're doing that without a breath hold, if you're doing that sprint without a breath hold, then you can even add a little breath hold when you finish. But if you've done that breath hold, you will do a couple of deliberate exhales, get rid of that carbon dioxide, back, nasal breathing. And the other thing that I've found, and I've had a little bit of research on this as well, because this can be a little bit controversial in terms of fitness world, is the recovery position. So some coaches will say, right, here we go, recover.
I was literally just about to ask you about this.
But this is the best recovery position as he moves off camera, is going hands on knee. And there's a couple of reasons why. This is what I've found. But again, there's a few papers, and there's not many, but there's a few papers out there on that. Is one, think about what we do intuitively. If you're knackered, you do that intuitively. Now, I think we should trust our bodies a lot more than we often do. We often try and interfere too much with what our body is doing. The other thing that's happening when you go into this position is you're taking the diaphragm, you're using the diaphragm just for breathing. You're not using the diaphragm for stability. So if you're standing and this, you're using the diaphragm for stability. And even though you think, oh yeah, this is opening the chest, or this is opening the chest, it tightens up the back of the body. Whereas when you get into this position, as it keeps disappearing off camera again, when you get into this position,
hands on knees bent over.
Hands on knees bent over. Can I go over here? Can you see you there?
Yeah.
When you get into that position, you open up the back of the body and you can get so much space in the back of the body, in the back of the spine. Think what they did in COVID. They were turning people onto their fronts so they could breathe into the back. And I've done this anecdotally with myself and with clients, and again with a couple of studies, is your resting heart rate, not your resting heart rate, your heart rate recovery drops much quicker. And again, when you think of it from a recovery point of view, what you want to do is you want to get that heart rate down. So a couple of big breaths is getting rid of the carbon dioxide. Also, that long exhale is lowering the heart rate. So you've got double whammy of blowing off CO2, lowering the heart rate, and then you're in this position where you're using the diaphragm just to focus on breath. You're breathing into the back. You're getting all of that really nice, rich oxygen exchange, nasal breathing, and you will see, if you've got your heart rate monitor on, you'll see how quickly that heart rate comes back down. Because I think it's about 20 beats per minute you're looking at, aren't you, in terms of recovery? And I've never found with any client or with myself that position. Yeah, you can recover, but you don't recover as quickly. And I've seen a few coaches put that online. This is good, this is bad. And I'm like, no. But again, this is things to test out. That as a coach, test it out with your players. Get them to see who can see if their heart rate comes down quicker doing that, as opposed to not doing that. But definitely, I find it the best way. And the interesting thing is as well, if you do it when you're running and you're outside and you go like that, everybody comes up to you and goes, "You're all right, mate." And it's like, yeah. And I remember a rugby player is like, "Oh, that looks really bad because it looks as if we're finished." And it's like, well, then you're tricking your opponents because they think you're finished, but then you get up and you go. So yeah, play around with that. I'm presuming, because you were nodding, I don't know whether you've thought of that, Ben. You disagree, you agree, or?
it's so funny. You literally took the words out of my mouth. I was about to ask you about the position for a few reasons, because when you see, especially again this time of year, pre-season, you'll see a running drill finish and you'll see players take all sorts of different positions, whether that's collapsing on the back or whatever it is, leaning up against anything that's you can sort of take your weight. But like you said, the tradition in football in pre-season is hands on heads, open your lungs up. And I remember watching, I don't know if you ever saw The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan documentary.
Oh no.
Tim Grover actually spoke about this, who's Michael Jordan's performance coach. He spoke about Jordan being pictured a lot on court with hands on his knees. And he spoke about it being exactly what you just mentioned with the rugby lads, that, oh, Jordan's gassed. He's not got anything left. And he's actually not. He's just recharging and recovering.
Yeah.
So it just really made me laugh when you said it, because I thought, we talk to players and encouraging into a position like you mentioned that just isn't optimal for them. In terms of because you mentioned there about hands on knees, but in terms of lying, if you've got players down on the grass or wherever they're running, on the backs or even on the fronts, would you try and get them out of that position?
What would get them into that position?
Basically just being fatigued at the end of a run. So I'm thinking that when you see someone doing, say, a time trial, and they've done a 1,500-meter max effort time trial, they'll finish, and some might just go hands on knees. Some will literally just fall to the ground and just be trying to catch the breath as well as they can. So you might have some on the back, some on the front. It just depends on the person. But is that being on the ground, is that something you'd encourage them to get up from, or like how would you manage that?
I think it's a really good question. I think what I would suggest is to actually maybe not get to the point where you feel as if you need to collapse on the ground, because you've maybe just gone a little bit far with that. But if you are really going for it, I would encourage them to go hands on knees and say, this is how I want you to finish the time trial. And explore that. Say, again, this can be something you play around with. Is like, here's your time trial, 1,500 meters. When you finish, you have to do this. You have to do big breaths and go back to nasal breathing as soon as possible. So that could be a guidance. I think if someone was on the floor, and again, I've not really thought about this, but I think I would most probably say prone is better. Because again, I'm just thinking logically, and what they were doing in COVID is to get them as much oxygen uptake and get people breathing into their back, I think is better. So if you think from a yogic point of view, not that you have to do yoga poses, but the child's pose is a really good position because you're breathing into the back. So I think I would encourage, if people were on the ground, to actually breathe into the back, because what can happen if you're on the front is that you can push the ribs forwards and then we lose. I need a wider camera on this. If the ribs are too far forward, you probably can't hear me, then the diaphragm's in the wrong position. So you want that diaphragm there so you can connect. So I think I would go on the front.
No, that's cool. Because I know what you're saying in terms of not getting to that intensity, but the fact is that clubs will be running fitness tests. So they'll be encouraging players to sort of maximize or go maximally in that run or whatever it is. They're not going to do that all the time, obviously, but if they do some sort of a test, that's what I'm thinking in terms of the recovery straight after the test. I think that answers the question great and goes against what a lot of people have been pushed towards for a number of years as well.
You know what I would say as well to that, and it might be a little bit controversial. A fitness test is, yes, how fast can you run that, but it's also how well can you recover from that. So I'm presuming as part of the fitness test is going to be, you did that in X amount of seconds and you brought your heart rate down in X amount of seconds. So actually, maybe somebody run it a little bit faster than the other person, but the one who run it faster took longer to bring the heart rate down. So again, this is maybe just thinking, is like, maybe the faster you went doesn't necessarily to mean you're more fitter if you're taking longer to recover. I might be totally wrong on that, but that's what comes to mind there, because I would look at the recovery in terms of, and obviously as you do in terms of overall fitness as well.
And that's just pushing towards being an efficient system, I suppose, isn't
Yeah.
it? When you perform and you want your body to be as efficient as possible.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you're doing 90 minutes, yeah, you might be able to sprint really quickly once or twice, but then if you don't sustain that 90 minutes, because you've pushed yourself a little bit too hard in the sprints. So it is about endurance, and that mental toughness at the very end when things might be going wrong and you might be getting tired. It's that whole mental well-being, I think, that makes a difference. Again, just going back to my nephew, my great nephew, he also does cold showers, and again, from a point of view of stressing the system, it's good. They're not right for everybody, so I'm not recommending this is the thing to do. But one of the things he said to me with a cold shower, when he's knackered at the end of a game or when things aren't quite going right, he's not thinking, oh, I had a cold shower this morning. He knows that mental toughness of putting himself through that experience then translates into that final 10, 15 minutes of a game as well. So just building that mental resilience can make, as you know, that whole team connection can make a big difference.
And it's obviously where breathwork comes in a lot, isn't it? Because anyone that's used ice baths, cold showers will know that you can get into that real, well, panic and hyperventilation, can't you, if you don't control things properly?
Yeah. And the last thing you want to do is hyperventilate anywhere near water.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great point. I've got so much other stuff I could ask you about, and I am a little bit wary.
I know that time-wise it goes so quickly. Sorry if I'm waffling a bit.
No, not at all. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is, well, obviously, there's obviously a lot of stuff out there around down regulating, recovering, maybe using breath work as part of a stretching mobility session or something like that. On the flip side of that, would you recommend anything for sort of up regulation? So if you're focusing before performance, maybe even before on a match day, is there anything that you target before they go out and do a warm-up, for example?
Well, I think what I would do, the upregulation, think the breath hold is going to upregulate because that's going to stress the system. So you've got to be careful with this because, again, what you don't want to do is do too much of intensity training or putting too much stress on the system before you go and play a match. So I think everybody's different with this. So some people need sort of like that little balanced, calming down regulation. Others need that little bit of motivation. So you could add a few really light breath holds to your warm-up. Do you know what I mean? You could just be jogging around. You could just pause for 2 or 3 steps as you're running. So it's just a little bit of a breath hold because that could just bump up the carbon dioxide. It's almost like unlocking the oxygen from the cells from the blood into the cells. That's a nice way to do it. The other thing with the breath holds as well is it helps when you hold the breath, your spleen can contract and that puts more red blood cells into the system. So there's varied studies on this. Some saying that lasts for like 10 minutes, others saying it lasts for quite a while. So actually, if you're getting more red blood cells into the system, you're getting a little bit more oxygen carrying capacity as well. So think of that from a point of view of, obviously, if you've got more oxygen carrying capacity, you've got more carriages in red blood cells carrying the oxygen around the system. That's beneficial. So I would say that's the simplest thing for preparing for a match, and it's something you can do as you're running. You know what I mean? You don't have to go and sit and do breath work and then go on the pitch. It's something you can do as you run onto the pitch. You could be doing it just standing around. You could be doing it in various drills and things. You can do the other thing I teach actually is I teach Qigong, which is really nice, simple movements, but are very powerful movements. And there is a breath practice called breath of fire. You might have heard of this one. It's where you just literally activate the diaphragm. So it's very much, so it's like panting, and that really works the diaphragm. And you can do that actually in your recovery position. And in Qigong, there's a really good position, which is the water buffalo. So it's the same thing. You're going down a little bit, so you free up the ribs there. That's quite nice because it's not, sorry, I know walking away from the mic there. It's not necessarily hyperventilation. It's just activating the diaphragm. It's just waking up your breathing muscles. So I would say those are a couple of things that you can do for that little bit of upregulation.
We've got a couple of minutes left before.
Yeah, I'm fine right up to the bang onto the hour if that's all right with you. So
no, that's cool. I just thought we'd sort of wrap things up around again the opposite of that, around down regulation. So if we're looking at pre-season period or even in season as well, obviously your key times for recovery are pre-season. They might be between sessions, so it would be quite common for players to go out in the morning, do a session, come in, eat, recover, and then go out and do an afternoon session, and then obviously recover again in the evening for the next day. Or in season on game days, obviously we're playing, whether that's on an afternoon or an evening, recovering, and then trying to get into training again over the next couple of days. So what are some things we can start thinking about around that down regulation and recovery?
So a couple of things, couple of really simple things that you could focus on there is, first thing, just slow the breath. So just consciously slow the breath down. Keep that in and out through the nose. Keep it light. Because what is happening when we slow the breath is the body is then sending the signal to the brain to say, if I'm slowing the breath, I'm safe, I'm calm, I'm relaxed. So your body goes into more parasympathetic. Your body is telling your brain you can rest. So just as your brain can tell your body, I'm stressed, remember it can send the signal the other way. So that's a really simple way of just down regulating. Keep the breathing light, keep it slow, and keep it low. Make sure you don't overbreathe, because often when we slow the breath, we end up doing big breaths. It's not about big breaths. It's about just breathing very lightly and softly, but slowly and low, deep. So that's the simplest way. If you want to do a guided practice, you can take yourself to about 6 breaths per minute, maybe breathe in for 4 seconds, breathe out for 6 seconds. That the research is showing anywhere between 3 and 7 breaths per minute is where we're hitting what we call our sort of like resonance frequency or coherence breathing. This is in a resting posture. This is not all day long. You don't want to be breathing 6 breaths per minute all day long. But the research has shown that that can increase heart rate variability. And we know heart rate variability, the higher the heart rate variability, the better recovery you tend to have. Heart rate variability is a little bit more complex than that, obviously. But actually, if you can increase your baseline heart rate variability, it means you're going to be more ready for the next training session. So just slowing the breath is one of the easiest things. And you can do that guided, or you can literally just sit and do it in a park, or do it as you're watching TV. The other way to a nice little practice is literally to help build carbon dioxide. Really simple practice is just to put your hands over your face. I'll move them away now so you can hear me. But you put your hands over your face and just breathe light. And see if you can get a sense of light air hunger, which you will do, because what you're doing with your hands over your face is you're pooling carbon dioxide. It's a bit like the old-fashioned way of treating a panic attack. They would give you a paper bag, and that paper bag is putting the carbon dioxide back into the lungs. And actually, it's very calming. So if you stay on the edge of light air hunger, that's really helping build your tolerance to CO2 as well. So I would say those are the 2 simplest practices for calming the nervous system, down regulating the nervous system, putting your body into rest and recovery.
Brilliant. Great. There's so much I could dive into.
I know we need a session 2.
No, I think it's been really, really good. And hopefully people have really benefited, because like we said at the very start, we didn't want to make it, or we wanted to make it clear that it didn't have to be separate sessions, because I know a lot of coaches are fighting over additional time with players. So that's not a massive what we're talking about now. We're talking about just maximizing what you're doing right now. So you've gave some brilliant examples and brilliant areas that can be applied into what they're doing right now. So I really appreciate you doing that for us. Will you just wrap us up by giving us anywhere you'd basically send people just to check out what you're doing?
Sure. My website is adventuresinmovement.com, and that will have, I do various retreats, which are fantastic, where you can do instructor training. The session that Josh did was a workshop in London. So yeah, you can find out more information there. My Instagram is @GrayCaws, GRAYCAWS. And I do live classes every Monday and Wednesday mornings, 8 till 8:30 on that. And we'll do a little bit of Qigong, we'll do a little bit of breath work, a little bit of functional movement, which is going to benefit anybody really. So feel free to check that Instagram out. Follow me on Instagram and watch those free live classes. YouTube is Gray Caws as well, GRAYCAWS.
Amazing. Thank you very much for giving the time and coming on, Gray. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me. Thanks, Ben.